Downtown Wichita is thriving in spots, but decaying in others, and that's pretty typical of most cities this size, and City Council wants to do something about that. What they do has, predictably, some people mad and others happy. We're going to start off with Bob Weeks on this one because, Bob, you've been looking at a lot of these plans. You forwarded a lot of information to me earlier today. We've been talking about this, and you know, I think, first of all, I think most people naturally they want the downtown of their city to thrive, because when it does decay, it's an eyesore, and it isn't a positive. But at what price? And let's just start off and talk about some of these plans, Bob, that you've read and get your thoughts.
Well, you're right, Tim. You know, when you ask people, well, would you like to have a vibrant, shining downtown? Well, you know, who doesn't? But there's, you know, the other side to it, that we live in a world of constrained resources. Since we have an economist right here, I'm sure you'll agree with that. And these things all cost. And it's not only that government costs, but it's government redirecting resources in ways opposite to what a lot of people have decided. And one of the things I'm really worried about, Tim, is really the impossibility of government planning to do these types of things. You know, a lot of the downtown advocates, they look at suburban sprawl that we have in Wichita and many other places across the country, and they say this is bad. And you know, government subsidized that suburban sprawl. Well, there's an example of government planning and policy doing something that they now think is wrong. We look at the urban renewal that took place in many American cities, including Wichita, and the disastrous results of that. That was a government planning process as well. A friend of mine is fond of telling the story. We're talking about downtown Wichita, that back in the 60s there was an oil company downtown, and they were located where Century 2 is right now. Well, government wanted that land to build the Century 2 and the development around it, so this oil company had to move. At that time, they didn't have a real strong connection to Wichita, and it was thought, you know, they might have moved to somewhere else besides Wichita, but fortunately, for Wichita, they located up on 37th Street in a suburban area. That's Koch Industries. Yeah. And if we had that type of activity downtown today, in other words, if Koch Industries had, you know, expanded their headquarters downtown, we'd have a vibrant, thriving downtown.
Mm-hmm. You know, Bob, when we look at our downtown today, we see things like, for example, Old Town, which, you know, it looks nice when you drive through there. There's some nice shops and different things to see. There's a theater down there, and I think you probably have some thoughts on the theater down there. What's wrong with that? Why shouldn't the government promote that? Why shouldn't we want that in our downtown area?
Well, the way that a lot of this work is done, it's through really, the government has some pretty blunt tools. They've got things like taxing and preferential treatment of taxes that they can do, things like TIF districts and things like that. And those things come with a cost to the rest of the people. So it's the government saying, you know, to someone who's invested on the outskirts of town or somewhere besides downtown, is the government really saying, well, you made a mistake there, and so we're going to take a competitor and we're going to set them up in a subsidized or incentivized type of environment. And I think that's really sets up a corrosive environment where government picks winners and losers, and if you're on the losing side, there's really not much you can do except to move. In some cases, that's happening. There are some real estate developers in town who are tired of our tax structure in Kansas and are stopping doing development further in Wichita. So we're losing some things that way too.
But aren't TIF districts just a matter of doing business across the country?
They are in a lot of places, and you know, there's been some academic research that shows that municipalities that use TIF grow slower as a whole than those that don't use a very much TIF type of financing. It's very good for the people who are the recipients of TIF, because no doubt activity does happen within a TIF district, but for the rest of the community as a whole, it's less than certain that TIF financing is a good deal.
Now, you've been to some of the meetings lately on these redevelopment plans, and heard both. In fact, there were some pretty good crowds at some of these meetings. Hundreds of people showed up, I believe, if I remember reading that correctly. So people are interested in this, and obviously people on both sides. One of the big things, one of the big issues was lack of a plan for this downtown revitalization, restructuring. What were some of the other concerns?
Well, one of the big things that always pops up when the questions are opened up to the public is parking. And you know, the recent funding of the Downtown Development Corporation's planning process, some of that money did come from the city's transit fund, I believe, recognizing that there is a transit component to what has to happen downtown. But I think people have this idyllic vision of people are going to get on these buses and ride downtown and everything. But as we were talking before the show, you know, here in Wichita, and really in most places across the country, people love their automobiles. And a lot of the downtown people, they have a bias against automobiles. They want to create create a pedestrian-friendly, walkable urbanity or something like that, they call it. There's really nothing wrong with that, except a lot of people really like their cars. They like the freedom, they like to get in the car and drive here and zoom around, and they like the cars themselves. So parking is always going to be a big hurdle, Tim, and I don't know if there's really any solution to it, except I think that private enterprise somehow has to get involved and provide the solution rather than government.
And why hasn't that happened, Bob?
Well, you know, it's expensive to build these structured parking type of things. Matter of fact, I had a meeting earlier this year with a prominent downtown developer, and he told me that, Bob, if I build this structured parking, meaning a parking garage, I'd have to charge a certain amount rent for each spot for it to be economically justifiable to me, and no one will pay that. So the solution is that the city gets everybody else to pay for that, but I submit that there's, you know, a reason why people won't pay what those parking spots are actually have to cost to build.
You know, it's interesting, Bob, when you talk about that, in a lot of larger cities, you rent out parking spots per year, and some of the costs are atrocious. They would be what you would pay for an apartment here in Wichita. You're paying to park your car on the street or park it in a parking garage. So, you know, that I think that there is some truth to that. It makes sense that is a real concern. But if you don't have the parking, people aren't going to come to a downtown event because they can't get there. They're, like you said, not terribly willing to ride buses oftentimes. We don't have any kind of a subway system, obviously, in Wichita. So what do you do?
Well, that's a dilemma that I don't really have an answer for, and I don't think that anybody really does, except government will try to plan and spend a lot of money trying to solve that problem, I believe.
But if 40 years ago that Jane Jacobs wrote her Death and Life of Great American Cities, and one of the things she pointed out is that frequently what kills a downtown are big projects. Big projects tend to be done by governments. One of the things I think that she stresses, sometimes it's maybe more important to look at all the different incentives and see if you're creating incentives to get rid of little people. And it's often little people who go into a dumpy looking building that's got cheap rent that start new businesses. Wichita has often been seen as a very entrepreneurial place. Part of it is there's always cheap rents.
Guys, good points. We are out of time. We do appreciate you being on the program tonight. If you have any questions or comments about our program, please email me at kansasweek@kpts.org. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.